Well, welcome to an encore panel discussion of how to conduct a trauma-informed investigation. I'm Philip Ciro. I'm an employee relations leader and very happy to be today's moderator of this incredible panel. We did this panel discussion last week at the Wisconsin Workplace Investigators here, and in the meeting, 50% of HR professionals said they encounter trauma often in investigations. We received really good feedback from the audience, and based on that feedback, we wanted to open source this really important panel discussion for the larger human resources, employee relations, and workplace investigator community. So today's panel, we're going to jump into it right away. We're going to do brief introductions. We're going to have a opportunity to develop a shared understanding of what trauma is and what it isn't, and also how to conduct trauma-informed investigations. Our first panelist member is Tova. She's an experienced HR professional and workplace investigator. She joins us today from Canada, where she lives and works. She recently wrote an article for Queen's University on trauma-informed investigations, which was one of the inspirations for today's panel. We've included a link to her LinkedIn profile and a link to the article in the comments to this video. Next, we're joined by Chiedza. Chiedza is an attorney from Seattle, Washington. She writes a weekly workplace investigation newsletter that has almost 900 subscribers. We'll include a link to her LinkedIn profile and the newsletter in the comments below. She will be sharing her perspective on trauma-informed investigations, both as a workplace investigator and also as a former plaintiff's attorney. And then finally, we're joined by Michelle. Michelle is a psychotherapist and a founder of International Institute for Emotional Empowerment here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. While not an investigator, she has deep knowledge of trauma and also helping clients understand and use their emotions. She helped support my organization through her emotional empowerment training. We had several employees dealing with trauma mention that it was a life-changing experience attending her training. We will also include her LinkedIn profile in the comments below. So with that being said, Michelle, we're going to turn it over to you, and you're going to provide us a framework of what trauma is.
Yes, thank you, Philip. Let me just share some slides with you as we start to discuss what actually is trauma. And if you're confused by this, you're not alone, because it can be a confusing topic. There is so many aspects to trauma that we want to look at. And the part that makes trauma confusing is, first of all, that the way that our minds can adapt around experiencing a traumatic experience is that it's not straightforward. Not everyone is going to respond the same way. And of course, we can't always physically see with our own eyes the impact that trauma is creating for someone internally. And so we can really not understand when someone has gone through trauma. So what I would like to do is I want to start by using a real life example that we use in our trainings on trauma to bring more understanding to this topic that can be a bit elusive. So I'm using this example of when I was walking down to Lake Michigan. I was going there to get centered, feel peaceful, and I was walking up this wooded path on the way back from the beach, and through the corner of my eye, I see a snake slither past my open flip-flop shoes, which makes me bolt up the hill and scream at the top of my lungs. And so my question is, do you consider this a traumatic experience? So just take a moment. Is that something we would consider traumatic? Interesting, right? Well, what if I told you that for the next couple months, every time I went back through those woods, that my mind was temporarily, just momentarily, turning tree roots and sticks into snakes? Now is that trauma? So it kind of makes us ponder things a little bit when we realize that our mind is kind of having a reaction to this even a couple months later. So Well, the reason why I ask you to consider this is because for two main reasons. First of all, your opinion on what is or isn't traumatic is really based on your emotional paradigm. And your emotional paradigm is based upon three main components. One is your self-identification within groups such as race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, socioeconomic status. This can inform your emotional lens and how you believe people should or shouldn't react. You can also be impacted by your family and what emotions were or were not expressed, if they were expressed at all. And then lastly, your own past trauma or experiences. So if you had a bad experience with a snake, you're more likely to say, yeah, that was traumatic versus someone who likes snakes or doesn't have an issue with that. So these three aspects form your lens, your way of how you see and relate to the world, which creates narratives about expectations and beliefs around other people's reactions. So we want to be aware of that. And the other reason why I asked your opinion is because the truth is that there really is not this full consensus on what is the exact line that constitutes trauma and what doesn't. So traditionally, there was this sense of, if there was no real physical harm done or witnessed, you're fine. It might have been a shocking or upsetting experience, but you're okay. However, the latest research is expanding our understanding of trauma to recognize events that create an internal imprint that cannot be seen, but where someone feels unsafe. So even though I was not in any real physical danger, what's important to note is that on an emotional level, I was left with this experience telling me that I'm unsafe. And when internally we feel unsafe, our minds start to make adjustments by either putting us on high alert, like mine did, where it was turning tree roots into snakes, or the mind will muddy the water, especially when you experience what I call like these small cuts to our psyche over and over. Think of someone, let's say a girl who grew up in a home where women were belittled and objectified. Her sense of self-worth and what it means, what's a healthy way that women should be treated is going to be muddied. The lens in which she's seeing herself is like these dirty pair of glasses, if you can see that. So what this means is that if she's experiencing sexual harassment at work, it may take her much longer to recognize this and especially to report it, because that is the water she's been swimming in. And so it's really important to recognize how this impacts our own lens, as well as someone who has experienced past traumatic experiences. So if we compare these guidelines to what I was going through with the snake, we want to look at two other components which will help us really identify, is that trauma still? Okay, you felt a little unsafe. Well, what another component that we look at is the depth, meaning the deeper the traumatic imprint, the more unsafe and the longer lasting that sense of unsafety remains in our psyche. So depth starts to really impact your beliefs about yourself, about others, and the world around you. And the greater the depth, it really impacts how you do or don't show up in the world. It impacts your relationships, your career, how much money you make, your health. We also want to look at the last component, which is the breadth, which is how all-encompassing this lack of safety feels. So what research shows is that the more you identify with groups that experience bias, the greater the likelihood of experiencing increased amounts of trauma. So if you identify with a group that experiences hatred from others, you may experience their hatred at work, when you go to the grocery store, when you're on your commute. And so this sense of lack of safety is all encompassing. And because you keep experiencing these types of traumas, it simultaneously deepens the painful emotional imprint that you are unsafe. Now, if we look at these guidelines and apply them to my snake incident, you can see it lacked depth. It was not long lasting, nor did I re-experience it. So there wasn't any impact on my identity or out into the world. Additionally, there was little breadth, as the only place I felt unsafe was in the woods, right? So on a continuum, measuring the depth and breadth of an unsafe emotional imprint, it's pretty low. But I think what's important to keep in mind is even these slightly shocking events can really impact our sense of safety and how we go about in the world based on that. So I invite you to keep these guidelines in mind, especially as Tova and Chiedza shared their experiences of what they have seen in terms of trauma responses through workplace investigations, as well as when we are looking to have a trauma-informed lens as we try to understand one another when we have an experience in the workplace. So I will let Tova or Chiedza chime in here and share more about their experiences at this point.
Chiedza, you want to do your thing?
Sure. Thank you, Michelle. Well, I really appreciate just the outline that you've given us on what trauma is and how we can kind of contextualize how that shows up for people. And as a former plaintiff's attorney, I worked with employees, representing employees in cases involving discrimination, harassment, retaliation, workplace misconduct, wrongful termination against employers. And in those cases, I saw trauma show up pretty consistently in working with employees. And some of the ways that that showed up often involved grief, people showing kind of overwhelming signs of grief when discussing different aspects of their cases or the experiences that they had had in the workplace. I often also saw just folks having a hard time letting go. And so often what you see is, and some of these you'll see show up in workplace investigations as well, but as an attorney, advising a client to settle a case, maybe best case scenario, and having those clients feel really emotionally tied to the case and not ready to let go or wanting to fight back. And you see that often in workplace investigations with potentially complainants who want to have their cases relitigated after the findings have been had and there's been a report out and recommendations. And so those are signs to look out for. Another thing that I often saw was shifting stories. Folks impacted by trauma often have a hard time with memory recall. And so I would have clients who, even if there was an established timeline, oftentimes I was hearing the story shift as they retold it. And that's something that comes up in workplace investigations as well, where you see folks involved in investigations who are impacted with trauma having a difficult time kind of recalling the story or the timeline of events. Another one that I see, this shows up often in particularly workplace investigations, but suspicion of note-taking. I often dealt with that with clients as well, where they were wondering, what details am I writing down as I'm writing? And this can show up for participants in workplace investigations who are impacted by trauma, wanting to know what it is that you're writing down. Emotional extremes is another one. We've talked about grief, but you see folks across the spectrum, emotional spectrum, dealing with extreme signs of anger or anxiety, fear, oftentimes fear of retaliation, or sometimes even lack of emotion and kind of this almost numbness to the case. And you see that in investigations as well. And then lastly is repetitive storytelling. And oftentimes when dealing with clients in lawsuits against their employers, I was hearing them tell the same story over and over and over again, and oftentimes focusing on the most disturbing or upsetting parts of the story, or even minor details. And so you see that oftentimes come up in workplace investigations as well, where folks who are impacted by trauma tend to loop on their story or loop on specific details of their story. And so those are some of the things to be aware of, particularly in working with employees in workplace investigations. And Tova, do you have anything to add to that?
I think you both covered it really well. I guess for myself, what I really want to convey here is that in trying to understand trauma and the trauma-informed approach in the context of the workplace in general, not just investigations, that it's essentially seeing workplace matters or interactions with a lens of compassion towards the behaviors that we may not necessarily understand. And another thing that I wanted to convey here is that it's not about understanding trauma from a clinical or medical professional standpoint, because oftentimes when I talk about a trauma-informed approach, the individuals I'm speaking to kind of look at me and say, but we're not doctors, we're not therapists. Why do we have to understand what trauma is? And so it's something that we should keep in mind, because while we're wanting to approach workplace situations and matters, it's important to keep this compassion lens on, because it enables people to feel more open in how we want to address the situation. But more than that, what it does not mean is that we're taking sides or favoring one side over another. So that's another thing that's important, especially for investigators and especially for those external investigators. Internal investigators do have that implicit bias, so they have to almost work harder at, you know, taking that neutral approach and giving that perception. So we need to have the appreciation for the impact that trauma can have. And Chiedza, you went into some really good, relevant details in terms of the various levels that trauma can affect an individual. So you've given examples that touched on the emotional side. You've given examples that touched on the cognitive and the physical aspects of what we might see, how it might manifest. Because recognizing these things and not being able to approach them appropriately can actually deepen the injury further, depending on the type of interaction that we're having and if it's devoid of that trauma-informed approach. So for example, so the other consideration is that we don't want to take the behavior at face value. So for example, if someone is disruptive or argumentative or uncooperative, or is presenting in a way that's seemingly a dishonest recollection of an event, and not actually consider the biology of what happens as a result of traumatic experiences. And Michelle went into really good detail in terms of what that might look like, the severity, the frequency, the breadth of trauma and traumatic experiences. Then we can really miss the mark on whether it's in the context of an employee relations matter or whether it's in the context of workplace investigations or any other type of interaction that we might have. So, for example, there are behaviors that might be exhibited that are rooted in trauma. Avoidance of eye contact, the avoidance of conversations, skipping appointments or meetings, demonstrating some sort of aggressive behavior or reaction. And so if we don't shift the way in which we engage individuals, depending on the settings, to consider what may have happened that could explain the behavior or the reaction, we could potentially miss pivotal moments that can go from conversations about lateness and absenteeism to this individual potentially going off on medical leave indefinitely and not at all getting all the information and just assuming that this person is not forthright in what they want to convey on their end. So I guess, you know, the other areas where we might see this other than workplace investigations are interactions involving disciplinary meetings or discussions about absenteeism or attendance or return to work meetings. So it's really about putting on that compassion lens and the other tools that we've been discussing with respect to trauma-informed approach.
Tova and Chiedza, I really appreciate that. And before we go into some strategies and techniques for trauma-informed investigations, Michelle, I know you've worked with my former company and did a really good job of working through emotions through your emotional empowerment practice. Tova mentioned as investigators, we often run into emotions during investigation. So any thoughts on when we're encountering emotions, what that might mean beyond just the face value?
Well, I think it's understanding that people are trying to process the experience of whatever they experience that they're seeking support around. And so it's really recognizing that, again, we've got to be clear about our own biases, because we have biases around emotions. We have biases around how we view emotional expression. And so if you're looking for specific guidelines, as Tova and Chiedza mentioned, that if someone's not looking you in the eye, or they have either that numbness or an emotional extreme, that means something so different for each individual. And so it's really, we're recognizing that people are trying to process this experience. And that is part of the reason why we want to create as much psychological safety as we can for them, by, first of all, being aware of our own biases, by understanding that we have what I call emotional blind spots, where if you grew up in a family where anger was freely expressed, then someone raising their voice is not a big deal to you. If anger was not at all allowed, and someone is worked up because of what they experience, and that gets heightened and heightened, that could automatically put a bias into your mind about that person that wouldn't be fair because of your own discomfort around emotion. So when my organization comes in, it's really to, first of all, help people process all the feelings that we all have as individuals, because we all are experiencing them all the time. And then to also recognize, especially in these traumatic experiences, that how someone is going to go about coping and managing something that was traumatic for them. It could have such a range, and to make assumptions around that would really be doing that person a disservice, your organization a disservice. And so we really want to be aware of that as much as possible.
Michelle, thank you for that. And so, Tova, what are some strategies that workplace investigators can deploy for a good trauma-informed investigation?
I think the first signal to me that a trauma-informed approach will be necessary or important is the nature of the allegation. So, for example, if we're looking at a sexual harassment case, already that's a highly sensitive situation, and not only because of the allegations, but that can also become more complex where the complainant is a vulnerable member of society, or there is intersectionality. So, for example, racialized or minority female. And Michelle went over that earlier on when she was talking about trauma, and how if there is some sort of intergenerational or earlier trauma on a community level, it can be compounded in situations like this. So this can be further implicated if the individual has endured past traumas, which may not necessarily be known to the investigator. So naturally, the first thing to consider in cases like this is, even before applying the trauma-informed lens, would be assessing and addressing the safety of the complainant. So what safety measures do we need to put in place? Putting in place interim measures, especially if there is concern for violence. So that might be changing reporting lines. That might be maybe instituting a hybrid work schedule so that the person is not necessarily in the same location as the perpetrator. And there's other examples of that. And you know, we talked about some of the examples of possible symptoms, such as avoidance of eye contact and avoidance of conversation. Maybe the person is overly agitated. It's that emotional self-regulation that one would expect under what's normal circumstances that may not necessarily be there. And so, you know, checking the biases, and Michelle just talked about that, and ensuring that as an investigator, I don't have preconceived notions about what happened or why, or how I would have approached the situation differently, or if, for example, what this person is saying really resonates with my cultural background and my personal experiences as a female, for example. Really checking one's biases becomes extremely important in situations like this. And so other examples of how I would implement a trauma-informed approach would be not rushing the process. So being really mindful about my obligation to complete the investigation in a timely manner, but also really, really being thorough about the information I'm asking, the details, giving the individual that time and space to produce that information or to take their time, making sure that they have supports in place at the time, even making sure that if they're seeking, you know, supports by way of therapy, that they have time for those appointments, giving choice when possible, such as, you know, the timing or the location of the meetings, when do they want to start, and when they're relaying their testimony. And again, showing empathy, but still maintaining neutrality. So for example, things like, I understand this is hard for you, as opposed to, I understand why you're upset. Again, we don't know how they're feeling. I might be upset in this situation. They might not be upset. They might be angry in this situation. They might be resentful in this situation. So it's trying to show empathy, but really it's a very, very fine balance. And not saying things like, I'd feel the same way if I were in your shoes. You know, and again, it's about taking a fair, balanced approach to all the parties. And this becomes really, really important because oftentimes we receive allegations from one side, the complainant, and, you know, we become really motivated and driven to find out did this happen or not, without considering how that might affect the respondent. And so really being balanced in the approach with the respondent and how this whole situation can affect them, and showing the same courtesy, respect, and empathy to the other side as well, in terms of allocation of time, opportunity to respond, and all of that. And just very quickly, what I wanted to, you know, give by way of an example, I recently, and I'm still doing it, received a complaint that was almost 40 pages long in terms of incidents, allegations, and of harassment. And while the allegations that she identified were extremely difficult for her when she recounted the experience, what further compounded her level of anxiety was that she didn't expect that level of detail and questioning in our interview. And it's not that she wasn't cooperative or anything like that. She was fully cooperative and willing to discuss the details, but because of the level of thoroughness that I wanted to go through was beyond the bare bones of just taking in her complaint, it took much, much longer. And so therefore, much time needed to go into really explain to her why it's absolutely critical that attention and time is paid to every detail of her allegations. And at the same time, the allegations were so sensitive and emotions were high that, you know, I was wary about, you know, the fact that recounting some of these events could be triggering to her. So for me, it was also important ensuring that I've given her enough time to talk and not cut her off to end a meeting, but at the same time, also giving her enough time in between meetings so that she can kind of tend to her well-being and mental health in the midst of it. So yeah, I mean, I hope that was helpful.
Tova, that was, thank you for that example and thank you for those techniques. And Chiedza, building off of that, what are some of your practices that you deploy in trauma-informed investigations?
Sure. Yeah, Michelle and Tova really covered a lot. And I'll just reiterate around, approaching things with an unbiased approach, right? We want to come to the situation without having any preconceived notions or assumptions about what an individual is experiencing. And so oftentimes when we see different emotions play out in investigations, what we may not know is that what we are experiencing is maybe a trauma response. And so being sure that we are asking folks, and what I do is I'll ask, can you share what you experienced or can you share what happened to you? Really helps to shake off any preconceived notions and get from the individual what their perspective was about what took place. Another thing that I do is really focus on transparency and accountability in the investigation process. And so making sure that when I'm speaking with individuals at the outset, I really like to make sure that folks understand what the investigation process looks like, providing for them materials on what the investigation process will look like, or if the organization has any policies about workplace investigations, making sure that they have those ahead of time. And then during our initial meeting, taking time to answer any questions they may have about the process before we get started. And we just want to be thinking about folks who are impacted by trauma, often are experiencing heightened anxiety, fear during the process. And so that really helps to alleviate some of that when they understand what the process is going to look like. Accountability as an investigator, what that looks like is really keeping your word. For me, oftentimes it's, letting folks know if I say that they're going to hear from me with an update, that they do hear from me when I say that they're going to hear from me, even if there are delays in the process, letting folks know, that there were delays with scheduling or that there's delays with gathering certain pieces of information as part of the process. I like to make sure that I'm keeping my word in that way. Another really important thing that Michelle and both Michelle and Tova touched on is just having a relational approach in investigations. I think it's really important for us to be building rapport, to keep in mind that we're dealing with people. I think as investigators, we can often get really focused on the process and getting through, our evidence and our analysis and our reports, but we really want to make sure that we are giving time for people to process through and work through the emotions that come through being a participant in an investigation, along with whatever it is that they may have experienced in terms of the workplace issue that we're investigating. Empathy is another one that has been mentioned that I'll just touch on again, is really just taking the time to try and understand the other person's perspective. Again, when we're dealing with people, we're dealing with real emotions, anxiety, fear, anger, shock, the full range and spectrum of emotions. And so we really want to make sure that we are approaching things with empathy and taking time to try and understand where participants are coming from. Cultural humility is another big one, particularly power dynamics. I know that as investigators, we like to think of ourselves as the neutral third party to come in. If you're an internal investigator, sometimes that can be even more difficult to establish yourself in that way. And so really thinking about power dynamics and the seat that you hold as an investigator is often seen by the witnesses that you're interviewing as a position of power. And so finding ways, again, to build rapport and establish trust are ways that we can be able to get folks to feel comfortable to share information with us and fully engage in the investigation process. And then lastly is just providing accommodation and supports. And so as internal investigators, being able to provide participants with employee assistance programs, employee resource groups or affinity groups where they can get peer support, any counseling resources that are available. As an external, I like to find those things out ahead of time from the organization so that I can also offer or point them in the right direction when we're dealing with investigations and sensitive issues. And so those are things that I do to try and navigate situations that trauma may be involved, or just helping to support employees through the process.
I love everything that you said, Chiedza, and it reminded me of really this part of empathy and having boundaries, because the reason why a trauma-informed approach is so important for yourself is that you'll create boundaries between you and the other people involved, that boundaries will support them. They're going to feel more psychologically safe with boundaries because it's going to establish that deeper trust. It's going to establish a sense of fairness. And I know you mentioned this last time, but I'll bring this up, Chiedza, that you going through the investigation might also experience your own emotional overwhelm, or you're carrying the weight of this, and having a trauma-informed approach will allow you to have boundaries around what's yours, what's theirs, and it just supports you to keep things a little more clean for you from a psychological lens. And again, that's not just for you, that's for them. That creates a sense of safety that, okay, this is being handled fairly. So the more we can have that that sense of being clear about our own biases, being aware of all these different components Chiedza and Tova bring up, it really creates these perfect guidelines that support empathy, psychological safety, as well as healthy boundaries in the experience.
Awesome. Thank you for that, you guys. In our panel discussion last week, we talked about credibility and credibility assessments. Often our cases come down to this, and it's a he said, she said type of situation. We're not going to do a deep dive on that in this panel discussion, but I'd just be curious from the panel, understanding some of the dangers of credibility assessments when it comes to emotions and trying to read those emotions, and how do you approach that, especially in a trauma-informed investigation?
Or I think some of the considerations around traditional factors, oftentimes we hear folks paying attention to demeanor, for example, right? And looking at people's behaviors. And Tova has mentioned this some, as well as Michelle, but things like avoidance of eye contact or fidgeting during an investigation. Some of these behaviors we see are trauma responses, and trauma can really impact the way that folks behave. And particularly in an investigation process. And so things that we might generally look to as indicators for lack of truth telling, or looking at credibility, we really want to stay away from that and be careful with looking for demeanor as a credibility factor there. I think we want to focus on consistency over inconsistencies. And so oftentimes we look at, I talked about earlier, shifting stories. We want to be paying attention to whether the key details of the situation that an individual is talking about remain consistent over time, even if maybe the timeline shifts, because again, we know that trauma impacts the way that folks remember situations. We want to consider the context of the situations that we're learning about from employees and witnesses that go through an investigation process. So we know that traumatic events can be overwhelming. And so we want to be thinking about how the context of the situation may have impacted an individual's ability to remember exactly what took place. And then again, emotional responses is a big one. Is we don't want to mistake someone's either extreme emotion or anger or sadness, or lack of emotion as a sign of dishonesty. And so we want to be mindful that oftentimes when we're seeing extreme emotion, there could be trauma at play in that situation. And so being mindful of that. And I'll invite Tova or Michelle to chime in.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say is that when we think about demeanor, use great caution, because we're trying to determine if someone is telling the truth or lying. And so our gut is, or the intuition is, to rely on, they're real things, and we've developed them over our lifetime based on our experiences. They're mental shortcuts that we've created over time. And so again, it goes back to our inherent biases, to believe them and to listen to them and use them in determination later on. And so as an investigator, when you start to feel this way, it should really be a red flag to stop and check your potential biases. Because we don't want to be stereotyping based on certain demeanor. Again, the avoidance of eye contact or the fidgeting, if they're fidgeting, they must be trying to hide something. And another thing that's important is we don't want to be shaping our questions towards a particular expected outcome, and thereby unintentionally creating some sort of confirmation bias. So it's very important for us to go in, and oftentimes many of us go in with written notes and questions of what we want, but we also have to be very open-minded in terms of what may come out of the information that may come out of these meetings, whether it's with the complainant or the respondent. And so, yes, it's good to have written questions, but we also have to be led by the information that we're given. And Chiedza very well put that, individuals who've had traumatic experience, their memory recall might be affected. And so where traditionally we would be looking for some sort of chronology in the way that the information is conveyed to us, we cannot have that expectation. We would, from my perspective, the approach is to let them tell the story. Where do they want to start with the information that they want to share? And another thing that I found is that even when that is the direction that is taken and they lead the conversation with how the information that they want to share, there might be still information that we may not think about or know that they know. So often what I like to towards the end of my meetings, what I'd say, is there anything I didn't ask you that you feel I should know? And it's important because it also touches on rapport building. It shows the individual that you really, really care to know all details, and not just you going in with an agenda of questions that you want to ask, that you truly, truly are taking an interest in what happened, because we weren't there in that situation. What if they noticed something? Or observed something, or heard something, or smelled something that we wouldn't have thought to ask about, that can trigger, other information that we can corroborate with. Because oftentimes individuals who've experienced traumatic experience, those are the things that will stick with their memories. And so if we give them that opportunity and open the floor to them and say, what else did I not ask you that you want to share with me, opens a whole other window of possible opportunities. And of course, building that rapport with the individual. So the only other thing I wanted to mention is that as part of the guidelines, it says, the past record, whether the alleged subject has a history of similar behavior. And so here I would really be careful about similar behavior, as in Canada, this would be introducing similar fact evidence. And so it's important to keep in mind that unless it is strikingly similar and in fact, then caution really must be used in using this type of information. And so the other option is that if it is presented as evidence, is to expand the scope of the investigation and determine if it's relevant and its probative value for the, the relevancy of the information and answering the questions that we want to address. So that's just something to keep in mind.
And Tova, you hit on something that I just wanted to expand upon a little bit, is that in situations impacted by trauma, or when you're dealing with folks impacted by trauma, particularly in the context of an investigation, cooperation is going to be a really good credibility factor to rely on here. So other witness testimony, documentation, anything that you can, evidence that you can use to help kind of confirm or support or refute even the witness's account or story is going to be really helpful.
I appreciate what everyone has said here. And what I'll also add to that is just to kind of humanize what it's like for someone in their emotional expression. And to think about it, like if you've been in a job interview or if you are in a networking event and you start talking, and then you have your own dialogue going on in your head about what you just said, it creates a demeanor and emotional expression where you don't know if someone's reacting about the past. You don't know if they're reacting about their judgment of themselves in that moment, or their judgment of how they reacted in the past. So in these incidences, if we're looking at emotional expression, it could be emotional expression from any of those three scenarios. So it might be about the actual event. It could be they're judging themselves internally that how they handled the event, or they're judging themselves in that moment, how they're coming across to you about expressing the event. So that's why when again, this caution flag that we're sharing on so many levels is so important. It's better to follow the guidelines and really stick to the facts, because reading emotions like that really can get us in muddy waters. And again, I like to humanize that, because we've all been there where we have an important conversation with someone. We want the job. In our minds, we're like, oh my gosh, why did I say that? And then our demeanor changes. Maybe we're not having that eye-to-eye contact. Maybe our emotions change. So a way to humanize it is bringing ourselves into those stressful situations that we ourselves have faced, and recognize we can have the gamut of things going on within us, multiply that for this person, depending on the situation, by 10-fold, 100-fold, and so forth. And we can really have compassion for what the gamut of what they might be experiencing.
Okay, guys, let's say we do a really difficult investigation and you've submitted your findings. How can we support our clients around the healing process or the aftercare aspect? What trauma-informed approaches might be effective for healing the workplace after a really difficult investigation?
Yeah, I think for individuals who are going through the process, I think it's really important for us as HR professionals, organizations, to just acknowledge the impact, right? Acknowledge that even just going through an investigation process in itself can sometimes be traumatic for folks. And so when we take the time to acknowledge that folks may be experiencing a full range of emotions, we can also allow space for folks to then express and move through those emotions in the process. I think recognizing that healing also happens on a continuum. It's not instant. And so making sure that we, again, are giving space to that full range of emotions. Folks can go from being anxious to angry, to, depressed or despondent, to finally, the acceptance phase and being ready to heal and move on. And so being sure that we have support systems that allow them to move through that process, whether that's, again, EAP programs, counseling, peer support groups, in a team setting or a departmental setting, making sure that we're having systems in place to rebuild and restore the workplace is really important. Looking at whether it's team building opportunities, or in restorative justice, you have restoration circles where folks can come and share their experience with one another, or mediation or facilitated conversations. Those are all really important support systems that help on an individual level. As investigators, and Michelle spoke to this a little bit earlier as well, is just being aware of something called secondary trauma, right? And so as investigators, we are dealing with sensitive issues, and we're really close to people who are displaying, can be displaying extreme emotional responses. And so we want to make sure that we are aware of the impact that that can have on us as investigators and those close to those sensitive details. That can show up as fatigue. It can be anxiety. It can be avoidance. If you see yourself not wanting to work on a certain case, that may be at play there, is that this case has particularly sensitive details that are difficult for you. And so just being mindful of that, being aware, and boundaries are an important part that Michelle talked about, of, we want to make sure that we're giving space to ourselves and to others. And so what that can look like is giving your time space between interviews, particularly when you're dealing with a sensitive case. What I like to do is sometimes take walks between interviews to make sure that I'm giving myself space and time to recalibrate, particularly in harder investigations. Making sure that we're scheduling breaks, that we're looking to colleagues for support, are really important ways to prioritize our self-care.
I think Chiedza is spot on with these, and something I'll piggyback on is what she was describing on the individual level are the 7 stages of grief. And so when an individual is going through this, whether they've been accused of something, or they've been the victim of something, they're really experience this as this was life before the incident, and now how do I reestablish myself, my identity after? And so there is a whole spectrum of emotions that people are experiencing. And then what I'll also say that I've experienced when I've come into organizations is, please do not forget the collective impact that this has on an organization. So again, going back to those identifiers with trauma, the stronger the depth of an experience. So it could have been one experience, but it was really shocking to an organization. That's going to have a ripple effect. Or the breadth of an experience, right? Like say this happened on a manufacturing line, and it wasn't that deep of an incident, but everyone on that manufacturing line feels like, whoa, this could have been me or impacted me. We really want to come in those scenarios and get proactive about addressing the ripple effect throughout the organization and the culture, because I've gone in 2 years later, and a company will say, we discussed this, but people have not processed. And so where my organization really comes in is supporting people to say, people nowadays do a pretty good job of managing their emotions. I mean, some more than others, but we've got to start leaning into helping them emotionally process the worry, the anger, the sadness, the guilt, whatever it is that they're experiencing. We want to help them process those feelings, because otherwise that is just emotional weight that an organization is carrying that's going to impact again, the company culture, teams, and how they communicate, trust within each other. The ripple effect is just very profound. And so the more we can get in there and recognize that, even though it seems like it's this little case over here that employees, of course, are discussing shocking incidences. And so it's really to look at this from a very an umbrella approach, where we're really looking at all the people that can be impacted from this, along with, of course, the people who were directly impacted.
I guess for myself, I think that both of you did a really good job summarizing the healing process and the aftermath. You know, as a workplace investigator, one of the most important things that I convey, whether it's in the first meeting or the second meeting, or you know, a repetitive multiple meetings, is confidentiality and for the integrity of the investigation, for the individuals involved, and so on. However, whether we like it or not, you know, there is rumors happen, and the workplace investigations do have a disruptive and polarizing impact on the team, departments, and sometimes on an organizational level. And yet, even if the allegations are not substantiated, you know, it's expected that these individuals will work together and continue to mesh and produce and be productive, especially where there are claims of harassment and discrimination, again, that were not substantiated. So you not only have to tend to the healing of the parties, but also the healing of the teams, department, organization. Because again, if they're unaddressed or not resolved, this is going to become an ongoing workplace conflict, and it can continue to fester and negatively impact productivity, the organization, team culture, and essentially the health and well-being of employees. So, and this can surface in so many different forms, such as more complaints or grievances, increased sick leave, a great number of talented employees exiting the organization in the aftermath of investigation. So Chiedza touched on this. Workplace investigations can be really helpful in these scenarios. It's facilitated, but the important aspect of that is that it really is an employee-driven process. This is where you get at the trust piece that Michelle was talking about. It is allowing them to take something that's possibly broken and to say, this is how it was, and what do we want now? How do we make it our own? How do we move this in a direction that we all own? And so it's about assessing the root causes of conflict, even if it's in an anonymous complaint situation, and then engage problem solving and solution implementation to address their own concerns, and that's done through various interventions, facilitated dialogue, whether it's team building and all the other things and all the other parts that Chiedza mentioned as well.
And I'll just quickly piggyback on that, Tova, as well. From my experience, people are yearning for this. Like, they just cannot, they are carrying that weight. They want a way to process this. And so the more people, each expert has brought up different ways to do this, and giving people that opportunity, it's just, they're just yearning for it, and they want to heal from it too. People want the tools, the guidance, the support, so that they can be their best selves again at work. And the more we can support them with that, the better off they are and the organization is.
Well, this has been an incredible panel. So in closing, we'll just recap what we've covered so far. We've talked about what trauma is. We defined that. We talked about how it shows up in investigations. We talked about trauma-informed approaches to have really good investigations. And then we talked about the healing process and the importance of having a good healing process. So panelists, I would like to know from each of you, what's one thing that you're hoping today's viewers will take away from today's conversation?
I can jump in. I'll just say that really, if you can take away that we all have biases, and so it's nothing to be ashamed of. It's shortcuts that our brain uses so that we can multitask and do all sorts of things. So the more we can normalize this, the more we can have compassion towards ourselves as well as others when we are doing this important work. And so compassion towards yourself, it will support you to have compassion and empathy towards others. And again, it will build that psychological safety and healthy boundaries.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback off of that as well and just say, what we're looking for in investigations is to improve workplace culture and to address issues. And when we have a trauma-informed approach to our investigations, we're really helping to build that culture of empathy, of understanding. We're destigmatizing trauma. It's something that many of us deal with in the workplace, and many employees deal with in the workplace. And so being able to build that culture is something that's really impactful.
For myself, I recently interviewed as part of a prolonged series of meetings with a complainant. And during the most recent meetings towards the end, the individual remarked, I just wanted to say thank you, that this has really helped me like therapy. I feel like for the first time, someone is actually listening to me. And I thought back to, my past in terms of work experience in the corporate world and in terms of my education. And I thought, ultimately employees are looking to have a voice, to be listened to be heard. And so the care that we as investigators take during the investigation process also really sends a message to other employees in terms of the respect and the organization itself, that it really does take matters very seriously.
Well, thank you, Chiedza. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Tova, for incredible panel discussion on trauma-informed investigations. To our viewers, we'll have the LinkedIn profiles in the comments. I encourage you to reach out to each of our panelists and connect with them on LinkedIn if this is an area of interest to you. If you have colleagues that could benefit from viewing this as well, please share the link with them. And then we'd also appreciate any reposts or likes on LinkedIn as well. Again, thank you for joining us today on today's really important topic, and that's trauma-informed investigations. Take care.